All right, so the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the University of South Africa are hosting an International Women's Day event in Johannesburg this weekend. In fact, tomorrow. International Women's Day celebrates the social, economic, cultural and political achievements of women. And Nthabiseng Nkosi, as a Communication and Stakeholder Manager at the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, she joins me now. Sister Nthabiseng, thank you very much for your time indeed. I mean, if we just look at the theme for this year, the power of memory, rewriting women into history, is this because women have been left out of history, have been left out of a lot of things still?
Yes, good evening, Griselda. Definitely, a lot has been done, but we feel a lot more still has to be done, and that women have not been accorded, you know, the full space that they should be. And the reason we have said, you know, rewriting women into history, this coincides with the building of a new Thabo Mbeki Presidential Library, which will be a first on the African continent. And in this library, women will have a special place dedicated to them, amongst other history that is written, you know, just about their struggles, but also what they have achieved. And when we talk about International Women's Day, if you would know, this is celebrated worldwide. So we are joining women and organizations all over the world that are celebrating this. The UN recognized, you know, International Women's Day in 1975, but the history this year is 111 years old because the commemoration started in 1909 in the US and 1911 in Europe. And this is significant because this year also marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration. If you remember back then, all the women went to Beijing and then they came back and it was, you know, Beijing this, Beijing that, so
If we look back to that Beijing Declaration, I mean, if we look at, of course, the efforts that are quite laudable that the Thabo Mbeki Foundation is doing through that library, but the day-to-day challenges that women still face, rife inequality when it comes to that gap between male and female, it is still there. How do we address that divide? In this day and age where we still have to have this conversation?
So most importantly, IWD 2020, the UN theme is I am generation equality, hashtag each for equal, because we recognize that even though so much has been done and so many conferences have been held and, you know, women have been marching, but so much more still has to be done. So we recognize those efforts, but we're saying we need to highlight that there's still so much more that needs to be done. And most importantly, that we record and document, you know, those achievements and those strides so that moving forward, Griselda, 20, 30 years from now, you and I may not be here, but our children should look back and say, where's the literature on this? Where's the history on this? And the TMPL, being the first of its kind on the African continent, will house this. So it's a legacy project. You know, it's not just about now, but it's a future legacy project. And interestingly, the library will not only house South African material and archives, but it's going to house material and archives from all over the continent and represent Africans that are even in the diaspora. The Timbuktu manuscripts, for instance, as you know, that's a big, big project that former President Thabo Mbeki is passionate about. Those manuscripts are going to be located there and, you know, stored there, and people can just come, once it's built, of course, they will come and just have an opportunity to go through this and to just see, you know, because that history is rich. The first university in Africa, if we document properly all of those things, we will realize that we've been doing it for a long time. But it's also in line with our vision and his vision of the rebirth and the renaissance of Africa. And he's always believed in that. And this is about that. But most importantly, we also recognize, you know, the role that women are playing, but to say that we must continue. And we have these dialogues to continue to highlight what needs to be done. And it's also intergenerational. So we're talking about 25 years of the Beijing Declaration. Our own kids that were born after 94 did not even know about this, but they can now look back and say, what was achieved, where are we, what still needs to be done, and this is about that.
So Nthabiseng, when do we stop the dialogue and start to see some action? Before we get to who the guest speaker will be, at what point do we say the time for dialogue is enough? Or do we ever reach that point? Because at some point, then something has to give. We can't keep speaking about the same thing over and over again.
So I think it's important that we acknowledge that dialogue must continue, because this is how we conscientize people and we raise the important issues. But a lot of work has to be done also on the ground. And when we look at just even in South Africa, the continent, we've achieved, so many things. Even at the AU, they have now a directorate of women and gender led by a woman. So that shows that from the dialogue we say we need those directorates, and those things are done. Access to even basic education. In 1909 and 1911, the women were protesting against working conditions. Now we have all of those. Women work, same number of hours, but the pay gap in some countries, in some regions, it's still so much more. On other levels, the practical things, for instance, this year, South Africa is chairing the AU. That's and correct. We talk about even silencing the guns. What does this mean for us in Africa, for women in those war-torn countries, because they've also been affected, but we are beginning to see, if you look at the UN, even peacekeeping troops, you have now more women participating. The UN itself has now, a division of UN women led by our own former Deputy President, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. So those are the strides that we've made, and I think that's where we can see what has been done and what has been achieved. But honestly, you are right. We need to keep going on, and so that we can have tangible, results, and just for future generations to see that something has been done and this is where we are.
Are we seeing enough will, though, from the powers that be? I'm talking about all over the African continent, all over the world, in fact, where you have, for example, you talk about the silencing of the guns. What does this mean for women on the continent? Women and children who are at the front line of these conflicts, the most vulnerable remain women and children. So is there enough will from the powers that be? I'd want to say political will on the African continent, do you think?
To a certain extent, yes, but to some extent, no, of course. And like we say, through these dialogues, through some of the forums, we see there are changes. Even though they are slow, we would like, obviously, to see much more being done. But that's why we continue to engage. And most importantly, I mean, you use your multilateral forums, like the AU, like the UN, to pursue those things. But I mean, we know worldwide there's also a rise, for instance, in nationalism and right-wing groups. So that also has an impact somehow, but to a large extent, we are moving there, though it's a bit slow. We need to, move faster and pick up the pace.
We're really running out of time. Let's talk about, the guest speaker for this year.
Yes.
Very interesting, a psychiatrist practicing, in public healthcare, in Palestine, in East Jerusalem.
Yes.
Very interesting that this particular guest is Dr. Samar Jabbar. Yes. Talk to us a bit about the choice of guest speaker this time. What do we hope to inspire a group of this generation of women through this particular guest speaker?
Yeah, so essentially, because it's IWD, it's International Women's Day, we had to look far and wide, but the choice as well, everybody knows the history in Palestine and what they go through, and we just thought, let's get a woman who can tell us about their experience there, but their experiences and their daily, living is similar to a lot of women, not just in Africa, but in other war-torn countries, and the effects of those on women and children. And she talks and she deals with trauma and how to build resilience. So it was mainly just about that, to give, that voice. But because the event will be attended by about 800 women from business, government, the diplomatic corps, and even the youth. We even have a group of South African matriculant female students who will come in and listen, because we're going to have book exhibitions and even book discussions. And we hope that even for the young ones, by the time they leave, they would have taken something from there and just learned a little bit. But more than anything, to say that the struggles of women all over the world are shared and they are the same. And that's why these dialogues need to continue.
And those struggles continue as well. All right.
True.
The fight is not over. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on The Full View this evening. Nthabiseng Nkosi, who is the Communication and Stakeholder Manager at the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, on its 2020 International Women's Day commemorative event taking place tomorrow in Turffontein.